Hi, we're back with A Day of Rest. Today I will read chapter 17, and here's the picture that goes along with that chapter. You can remember it as I read. The long shadow of the mountain lay across the valley floor as Doug turned the curve around the base of the mountain and saw Charles' house on the left. Set back from the road in a grove of trees, the house was partly hidden, but Doug was sure there was no light in the house. Doug drove on past Charles' house until he came to the lane that separated his field from his brother's property. He parked his car much as he had done many times before that summer. He got out and climbed to the top of the wooden gate. The herd of young cattle swung their heads to look in his direction, but didn't move since they saw he was not carrying anything to interest them. Douglas dropped to the other side of the gate and walked over to check the salt block. It was intact. There was plenty of grass. The mist was rising off the creek, but Doug could see that the cattle could make it to water without any trouble. This was the time of day Douglas liked best. Many a time when he was young, he had come to the pasture to check on his dad's cattle. There had been a rail fence then, but the pasture and the creek and the mountains beyond had looked the same. Many a time as a small boy, he had watched the mist rise up from the creek and spread out along the base of the mountain. The mountain top had looked like an enchanted island. He had determined that someday he would live on that mountain top, and he had done it. He had made as little change as possible in that mountain, leaving trees standing tall as they had been when he was young. He only cleared enough land for the garden, a pasture, and the buildings. Everyone thought he was too lazy to cut the rest of the timber. He let them think so rather than explain his feelings about the mountain. A whippoorwill began its shrill call. The shadow of the mountains that darkened the valley began climbing the foothills of the range of mountains in the east. The mist thickened above the creek and spread out across the pasture. The even clop of a mule being ridden at a steady pace caused Doug to hurry his steps back to the gate. It might be Al returning from church. "Checking on your cattle, Doug?" The voice came out of the semi-darkness, but Doug recognized the deep bass. Ralph McRayler was a friend from his school days on Upper Willow Creek. Ralph brought his mule to a halt as he finished speaking and turned the mule in toward the gate. "The cattle are fine," Doug answered as he opened the gate enough to walk through and then closed it. "They look okay to me," Ralph agreed. "I passed the church just now and the doors were open," Doug remarked casually. "I would have thought you would have been there. You're a deacon, aren't you?" "Yes, I am," Ralph agreed promptly, "and I planned to go to church tonight, but got stuck at my aunt's house." "Your aunt?" "Liza Barton. She's Sarah's mother's sister." "Is Mrs. Barton sick or something?" "She had a bad fall, and Sarah was worried," Ralph explained. "I took down some chicken and dumplings for her. I had intended to stay only a few minutes and then leave, but the men were gone, and she looked so bad that I didn't want to leave her alone. So I stayed until Ed and Slim returned." "Have Slim and Ed been working on Sunday?" Doug asked as he wondered about that fall that Mrs. Barton was supposed to have had. The stories he had heard about Slim getting drunk and beating up the woman might be true. "Don't Mrs. Barton object to their working on Sunday?" Doug asked. "Aunt Mary gives me a lecture if I do more than get the ox out of the ditch." "Working?" Ralph pondered the question. "I don't think they do much work any time, although they did have their wagon with them when they drove in. It had some chopped wood in the bed, but the wood was weathered and there were some old quilts thrown over the back, so I suppose the wood had been piled in there for some time, and they were too lazy to take it out. Slim and Ed said they had been to visit their cousin who lived south of Green Crossing. I didn't know they had another cousin living here beside Walter, but then I don't know them very much. A wagon with cut wood and quilts. Doug was now positive that Slim and Ed were the ones that had taken Bert and Jim. Doug walked through the gathering mist and darkness to where Ralph sat on the back of the mule. What he was going to propose, he didn't want anyone to hear. "The fog is rolling in fast," Ralph spoke as Doug approached. "I'd better be getting along. Sarah will be waiting supper, and I still have my chores to do." "Ralph?" Doug stopped. He couldn't bring himself to put Ralph into trouble with his relatives. "Yes?" "I'll just walk along with you to Charles' house," Doug spoke quickly as Ralph picked up the reins. "Aunt Mary needs one of Charles' boys to help with the canning next week." "One of the boys might be there, and you could leave a message with him," Ralph agreed as he gave the reins a slight flick, starting the mule into motion. "The boys will be at church," Doug said positively. "If the church doors are open, Charles will be there. If Charles is there, the whole family is there." "Charles is a good man," Ralph nodded in agreement. "He probably is at church, but at least one of his sons isn't. I saw the youngest walking along the creek just as I said goodbye to Aunt Liza." "Jas?" "He's the one. He had his fishing pole with him, so I guess he's been down to Lower Willow Creek trying to catch that big catfish everybody's been talking about." "That sounds like Jas," Doug agreed as he gave a sigh of relief. He wanted Bert to go fishing with him this afternoon. There was no need to get Ralph in trouble with his relatives, and no need to involve Charles. He would ask Jas to help and explain later to Charles. Jas was just the one he needed as a lookout. He was courageous and agile. Furthermore, he knew the layout at the Bartons. Doug stopped and looked back through the fog. Ralph pulled the mule to a stop and turned back to look at Doug. "If Jas is still coming, there's no need for my going on to Charles' house," Doug stated. "I can give Jas the message. He'll probably be the one that Charles sends up to help anyway. That is, if he doesn't skin him alive for being out so late on a church night." "While you're trying to catch that old catfish, time passes fast," Ralph commented. "Do you remember that time we were fishing over on Rock Creek?" "Yeah, I remember it all too well. We fished until dark and then got lost on the way home," Doug laughed. "Dad made me cut a whole cord of wood before he let me go to bed." "Those were the days," Ralph laughed. "But I'd best be going along. Jas should be coming along any minute. When you get some time, come down and see me, Doug." "I will, Ralph. Come up and see me." Doug watched until Ralph and the mule disappeared into the fog, then turned and stared down the way that Jas would come. If Jas came along soon, he should be able to get Bert and Jim without too much trouble, and he would get back home in time to get the cows milked. He wondered how Susan and Aunt Mary were getting along. And that's the end of chapter 17.